All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Today is September 20th, 2022. We're going to do SEVA VentRounds Express, where we're going to see targeting schemes explained, that this is part three. We've spent the last two discussing several of the targeting schemes and showing examples on waveforms for everybody to get an idea of what are these targeting schemes and how important they are. We discussed particulars of ventilator modes. There's no endorsement of any particular mode, manufacturer, or company. Whatever we say, it's our opinion. It does not represent the Cleveland Clinic. I receive fees and royalties from books and chapters and lectures and the rest of the uh, disclosures that you see here. Rob will not join us today. He has other commitments, so you get only me. Keep your microphones muted. I may call upon you if I don't understand something or any of your comments, but you do use the chat function. It really works really well to start comments and monitoring it routinely through the presentation. At the end, our employees of the Cleveland Clinic get CMEs. So we have been reviewing these over the last four sessions. Just to remind you, a mode of mechanical ventilation is a predetermined pattern of interaction between the patient and the ventilator. And to better characterize that type of interaction, it's made by this particular combination of a control variable, so what controls the breath during inspiration, a breath sequence, the type of breaths that can occur during the interaction, and the targeting scheme. And we created this thing called the tag, which is the taxonomic attribution group, which essentially tells you, summarizes the control variable, which we have discussed. This could be only pressure or volume. The breath sequence, which can only be all the breaths mandatory, so continuous mandatory ventilation, a combination of mandatory and spontaneous breaths, or only spontaneous breaths. And then that combined with one or more targeting schemes. And there's 7 so far that we have described, but there easily can be more as technology advances. And for that, there's the tag. And again, you see here in the first part is the breath, the control variable, then the breath sequence, and then we often put one if it's just a type of breath. So if it's all of them are mandatory, you will only see one targeting scheme. But if it's a intermittent mandatory where there's 2 type of breaths, mandatory and spontaneous, the first small letter highlights what the targeting scheme is for the mandatory breath. The second one, which follows a comma, refers to the spontaneous breath. We have also reviewed several times that within the breath sequences, there's several types. And we call them type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. And that is because IMB, as it has been described in the literature for years, decades, has evolved actually. So what you know as type 1, as the classic IMB that is described usually in the literature is the type 1, which are mandatory breaths that are delivered at a set rate, and spontaneous breaths can happen at any time in between. And they can be synchronous, so you can synchronize the spontaneous breath with the mandatory, but you will get that set rate that you have set on the ventilator. So if you set it at 10, you'll get 10 breaths. If you set it at 5, you'll get 5 breaths. Type 2 is mandatory breaths only delivered when spontaneous breaths are below the set mandatory rate. And so if you go below that set mandatory rate, and there's different algorithms to calculate that, then you start getting mandatory breaths. Otherwise, you could be breathing fast and tiny breaths, and you would not get any mandatory breaths. So this is a different type of IMB. And you see a couple of examples of modes that do that here. Type 3 is when there's still mandatory breaths, but they are only delivered when the spontaneous minute ventilation falls below a preset value. And there's different ways that this has been implemented, but essentially what you're trying to assure is that the patient will always get spontaneous minute ventilation within a certain number. And if it goes below that, then the mandatory breaths will kick in. And again, you see here two implementations, ASV and mandatory minute ventilation in the Draeger. And type 4, this one is very rarely seen. Essentially, it occurs only on one mode right now, which is this one volume control with dual targeting on the servo when they press a button that's called flow adaptation. And essentially, they start as mandatory breaths, but they are changed to spontaneous breaths because you change from a volume control to a pressure control. And if the breath, the inspiratory effort is large enough, you can trigger and cycle the breath on your own. So essentially, from going from a mandatory volume control breath, you may end up only receiving spontaneous breaths. And so that's type 4. And perhaps with time, more types will come up. But this is where we are today. And so we talked about the targeting scheme, and the targeting scheme for ease of your brain. Think about it as the programming that you use in the computer of the ventilator to determine how it is going to interact with the patient. And so essentially the software, how it which is where you put the targeting scheme, how does it interact with the hardware and the patient? And obviously the operator can put instructions into that software. The more instructions you put, the more you are gonna the more you work. And there's modes that you need to put less instructions into the software, and the software will calculate them for you. And so you'll see that we have described so far 7 targeting schemes, and they go from simple, where you put almost all the entries. So if it's set point, essentially that will be volume control or pressure control, where you have to tell how long is the I time, how fast is the rate, how long is the inspiratory pressure and whatnot, to dual, biovariable, servo, adaptive, optimal, and the one that is essentially automatic, in which you just enter the height and the target minute ventilation for the patient, and then it will adjust several parameters and all the settings on the ventilator using artificial intelligence tools, is what we call intelligent. And there's examples for all of these. So we have been reviewing several of these over the last several weeks, and so now we're going to review a couple more. All right, great job. So with that we start, and the ask over here is that as you look at this, and I was very intentional on keeping the commercial name so that we can discuss that, but the ask for you right now is to tell us what is the tag for this mode, and you can chat it, write it on the chat. Have no fear. Essentially, the chat doesn't appear anywhere on the video. It's just for us to be able to have a conversation. So as you're looking at this mode of mechanical ventilation right now, what is the tag? So what is the breath control variable? What is the breath sequence? And what is the targeting scheme? And I'll ask everybody to put in your thoughts. Have no fear. This is my facilitating pause to be sure that everybody's entering. All right, so we have several entries so far. This is the beauty about this, and so let's analyze it little by little. So everybody across the spectrum saw this as pressure control, and I'm going to agree with that statement. If you look at the volume waveform, the flow waveform, whenever I look at these waveforms, that's where usually my eyes go to take a look. is to see how the flow waveform looks, and you can see that it has no geometric shape. Actually, it changes from breath to breath, each one of the configurations, and in some of them there, and on all of them, there's evidence of PMOS, meaning that instead of being let me change colors here so you can see it a little bit better. So instead of being a peak with an exponential decay, you see an area on top that it's not decaying exponentially. You can see a little bit of the exponential decay at the end of a couple of breaths, telling you that the effort has finished, and you're seeing just the time constant of the lung. So this is definitely a pressure control. And after I see this, I always go and look at my waveform to be sure that what I'm seeing, and it's again consistent with a pressure control breath. So ventilators are mediocre pressure controllers, because if this was ideal, it would be a beautiful, nice, pretty square what you would be seeing. So it should look just like that, which it doesn't. And so the rest is because of some settings that they have put, and the others are because of performance of the vent in the presence of PMOS. So you have PC, so we all agreed. Then every single one of you agreed that this was CMB, so that means that all breaths are mandatory. And you have here the markers that the breath is actually patient triggered. So the patient triggered all the breaths, every single one of them. However, the next question is this time cycled or is this patient cycled? And sometimes it's very hard to say. I mean, there's some patients that are very regular on the way that they breathe, which may be a marker of the level of disease that they have. But there's some hints here that tell you that this, even though it was well set, that this may be a time that the I time was set. The first marker that you have starts up here, but you cannot trust necessarily the tag on the ventilator, what they put here, because there's things that can change it. The second is that the I time essentially for each one of the breaths is identical or very similar. You can see the amount of time that it takes for each one of the breaths, and it looks very similar. And then you have some features that tell you, this seems like this is time is using time to cycle, in which you see different flows at which it is crossing the zero flow. So that's why this is CMB. Ariel, I'm not going to talk about IntelliSync in this presentation, so we'll talk more in another session. Thank you for bringing it up. So that is the pathway of knowing that this is most likely CMB based on what you're seeing. And finally, there's a couple of targeting schemes that came up. There are some people that thought that this was A, meaning adaptive, and the others that thought that it was set point. And in truthness, this is adaptive, and it's very hard to see that on this breath sequence because what you're seeing is irregularities on the height of the breath, of the pressure that is being delivered by the ventilator, but it could be a manifestation of the amount of PMOS that the patient is having, and it's not entirely clear from this sequence. So if you set point, you just by looking at the waveforms, and I would have had to agree, it's very close in general, and the tidal volume is varying based on the effort of the patient. However, we intentionally left this up here because it's a good teaching point for all of you, that when you read the name of the mode, I mean, first of all, if you are lucky enough to know what APB stands for, APB CMB, but second is, what does it actually do? And sorry. And in this case, what it means is, and please, Ariel, correct me, since you use more the Hamilton, this is adaptive pressure ventilation, and it refers to what we would use in other ventilators. It's the same as BC plus or PRBC, or as you see here, APB CMB. So these three have the exact same tag, and that's the benefit of knowing CMB-A of knowing that this is adaptive, meaning if the patient starts doing more effort, and just remember the graph that we have reviewed many times, where you have the work of breathing or the ventilator, so or the pressure that the ventilator delivers, and here you have the pressure from the patient. When you're in adaptive, as the patient does more effort, the amount of support that the ventilator is gonna give is gonna go down, and so this is what happens in adaptive modes. And one of them being PCCMB, as well as the other mode that does this is BC volume control CMBS. Those are the two examples. So thank you, Ariel. So adaptive pressure ventilation, that's the name that the company put for this mode, which probably is closer to our tag, and it has several of the items. It would be really useful, I think, if the companies would start putting actually the tag name, even if it's in a parenthesis, so people know what their mode actually does. So great job. We identified most of these modes variables. Alrighty, let's do another one. Here you go. So again, I put the mode of the ventilator up here on the top. This is a beautiful graph. And please go ahead and tell us what the tag is. Write it on the chat, have no fear. The benefit of when you write it down is that you commit, you're testing yourself. Otherwise, you become a passive observer of life. Right now, you have to put it in and see if you're going the right way or the wrong way, and we can discuss it. This graph has a lot of information, but it's good for us to go at it. All right, they're starting to come in. I remember the first time I pressed this button, I still didn't know what it did. I had no darn idea about what this button, and in the prior model of this ventilator, there was even less guidance, and I pressed it and nothing happened. I didn't see anything happen, and I'm going to explain why. So excellent. Thank you very much. So majority of you chose, or actually all of you chose PC. And so absolutely, you have very clear guidance here that the flow is not being controlled. Actually, you can see how instead of being this exponential decay that you would expect in a passive patient, all of this area is a manifestation of your PMOS. In these two little breaths that are over here, that actually may seem even more passive. Sometimes, depending on the scale of what you're watching, you will not be able to see the exponential decay, but you see how it peaks and it reaches baseline relatively fast. And this may not be the presence of PMOS. It may just be that there's so little compliance, so little, the time constant is so short that you don't get to see it as pretty as in all the devices. The same actually happens sometimes in patients with very high resistance, in which you may see actually the curve go like that and then it cuts, and the patient is completely passive, but it has such a such a long time constant that you may not be able to see that decay as you think about it. So absolutely pressure control. All of you identified appropriately the IMB strategy, and there's a couple of guidance here to see. The first one is let's start. There's two types of breath here. So I'm going to start with the one that tells you that it's mandatory, and it's this one over here. So the first thing is that you don't see the marker. So the only one that knows that the patient triggered, or that a signal that the ventilator identified to be a patient, is the ventilator. And they guide us with different markers. In this case, it's this white line that you see. So it was a pressure trigger breath. This one doesn't have it. And as such, that means that it's a mandatory breath because it was triggered by time. And that immediately makes it a mandatory breath. If anything on the breath is controlled by the machine, then it becomes a mandatory breath. The second one is triggered by the patient. We know that because we see this decay. And then we see how, as it crosses, it goes from inspiration, that it's active, very active, to an active exhalation. So actually the patient is exhaling actively. And you can see it also in this one. You see the patient was actively exhaling, pushing air out. And so it goes from inspiration to expiration. And many people get confused by this peak here. But that's another manifestation of an inappropriate, how mediocre the ventilators are controlling pressure. Because this is because the flow is now changing direction. The patient is starting to increase the impedance of his chest wall. He's starting to move air out, and the ventilator was trying to keep the pressure at some level, and now it sees all this pressure, the pressure elevates. So don't get, sometimes we get confused because we see this and we identify it as a late cycle, but you can see it here that it crosses really nicely the zero flow line, the zero flow baseline. And so this is and these two are different size. And so this tells you that these are pressure support breaths and these are mandatory. Actually, you also know that this is cycle by time. This is a key item that I look when I'm trying to figure it out, because there's no flow. And that means if there's no flow, that means that this is cycled by time. So the ventilator just closed. So actually, you can see here when there's a late cycle in a passive patient, there's still this kind of peak here that exists, and it doesn't mean that this one was a late cycle, this one was a late cycle. So pretty good finding. You all identify this was a type 2, meaning that when there is spontaneous breaths, the mandatory breaths disappear. And for this, there's an algorithm actually, and I know Ariel has been working on trying to decipher, reverse engineer, understanding how do they calculate the amount of apnea time that you need to have according to the rate to ensure that the pressure control breaths are turned off. But in this case, you can see that there is one mandatory breath and another mandatory breath, and there's these spontaneous breaths. And so they're still coexisting on this presentation, but they may have disappear later depending on what the rate the patient has had, if it's above or below the set rate. And finally, it's pressure support CPAP. So meaning that the mandatory breaths, these ones over here, I'm going to erase everything. This is getting too crowded. Here we go. Sorry. These breaths over here, the mandatory breaths, are pressure controlled. So this one over here is pressure controlled, and this one over here is a pressure support breath. And the set point for that are set points. So the targeting scheme is you have to set the pressure for the mandatory and the pressure for the spontaneous breaths, and you can immediately see that in this case, for this patient, the mandatory breaths were all the way over here. The pressure was set, and for the spontaneous breaths, it was set over here. So there's two different pressures that were set for each one of the breaths, and so this was set point. Questions, comments, anger management? A common question that comes is, Eduardo, why would I use this mode? I mean, this is so cool, it's so complicated, but why would I use this? And you have a fair amount of patients always that you are in the transition point in which you, for example, are stopping the sedation, and you want that the moment that the patient starts breathing spontaneously, that then they can maintain or do spontaneous breaths, and that the synchrony is better. So that would be a case scenario in which you use that. Another situation in which you may want to use this in patients that are having episodic apneas, and you don't want them to be shifting to the alarm setting of if you had them on pressure support, then they go into the alarm setting and they get stuck on pressure control and the alarm is going off all the time. So there's a series of circumstances in which this will help you as a respiratory therapy or as a physician to minimize the amount of sedation and allow a better interaction with the patient. You can imagine that if we kept this patient with these different types of breaths and on pressure support, they may be getting, there may be episodes of apnea, or if I try to keep them on pressure control all the time, there may be desynchrony that would occur. Nonetheless, there's a lot of other challenges that you can see on this mode, but I thought that it was a good example for you to read. All right, questions? And this is the last example. This is a good example of another mode that we have available. The mode name is up here. And what do you think the tag is? All right, I'm starting to see more and more responses, but again, what you see is people are choosing PC, and that's the right attempt. Actually, in this case, this is a beautiful example that if you look at the pressure control waveform, it's a beautiful pressure control waveform. And then you look at the flow waveform and it looks like, I don't know, like a really bad ride down a slide with some humps and bumps in between. And so what you're controlling is actually the pressure, and the flow is dependent on the respiratory system characteristics. And you'll see this in this type of ventilator in particular, the flow sensor is at the Y, meaning by the trachea. And so sometimes you don't see as beautiful as you want. Yeah, good point. At that time, it will not look as nicely exponential decay, but you have to see through it. There's some aberrancies that are happening in between. You all recognize that this was Imb. However, if I had not put the name here, if I block here the name, and you look at it again, you don't see any spontaneous breaths. All of them are mandatory. This breath is mandatory. It's triggered by the patient, the machine. You don't see actually any evidence of patient effort. So if I had just shown this, you would have read it as pressure control CMB ventilation, and you could not really tell what is the tag. But because I left the mode, the commercial name up here, you were able to discern that this was actually Imb. But just by looking at that graph, you would not have been able to make that difference unless there had been some spontaneous breaths by the patient. Many of you recognize that this is Imb type 3, and that means, and actually I'll point out one of the items of ASB is, if you notice here, the caregiver enters the percent minute ventilation that the patient is going to get. You don't enter the tidal volume, you don't enter the rate, you enter the percent minute ventilation. And that is based, and then the machine, based on the gender and the height of the patient, will calculate using the equations of Otis and Mead, and they will come out with the tidal volume and the respiratory rate that would be the optimal to minimize the work of breathing on this patient. And so if the rate that the patient is getting right now, 12, and the tidal volume that the patient is getting, 326 or whatever it is set, is actually calculated by the machine using an optimal algorithm. And that's why you see that little O that the team chose, O for optimal. And so it calculates very nicely. Actually, if you imagine this is a graph, that's a terrible line, but just forget about it. So here you have here you're going to have tidal volume, and here you have respiratory rate. And if you graph work of breathing, it looks more or less like that. And so what the machine is calculating is a respiratory rate and a tidal volume at which you are using the least amount of work for it. That's the optimal part. And it does that for the mandatory as well as the spontaneous breaths. And to implement that tidal volume, it uses an adaptive pattern. So it will adjust the inspiratory pressure to achieve that. The intelligent part that you all put, the I, comes because the makers of this mode essentially said, well, we want to keep the tidal volume within a range that it's protective, right? And so they said within this range of tidal volume, we want to stay because that would be what we know at this point protective. And then they also have the ability to measure the time constant, and they will say, we don't want to generate auto PEEP on this patient, and you can generate then a graph, a square that we call, in which if you stay within, you're not going to have auto PEEP or very short inflation time that could be deleterious to gas exchange, and you will not have very low or very large tidal volumes. And that's the intelligent part of this mode, essentially calculating and adjusting by measuring continuously the time constant, as well as measuring the work of breathing for that size of patient. So if you want the patient to get more support, you increase the minute ventilation that the patient needs to get. If you want the patient to get less support, you decrease the percent support that patient will receive. If the patient is paralyzed, it will behave as a pressure control CMB, but using you will not be entering the tidal volume or respiratory rate. And there you go. With that, we have finished SEVA Express. I wonder if there's any questions from the team or any comments. If not, let's meet in G62 to do some live bend rounds. Questions? Very good. Thank you very much. See you in a couple of weeks.